When it comes to fantasy settings, people love making power rankings. For example, who is stronger than who and who could defeat who in a fight. In Middle-earth, this is somewhat difficult to do because power doesn't just come through strength. It's even difficult to rank races by strength because they're all good at different things, and how good they are at those certain things differs within the entirety of that race. Regular men and Numenorians are going to have vastly different capabilities. So in this video, we're not going to rank races by power, but instead talk about what they're broadly the best at compared to the others. Let's start with the Elves. With Elves, there's quite a broad spectrum when it comes to characteristics and capabilities. For example, the metal and stone-loving, warlike Noldor were very different to the forest-loving, peaceful Nandor. I want to start with characteristics that most, if not all, Elves share that they excel at more than other races. The first one is in appearance. The Elves were on average the most beautiful of the races in Middle-earth, although the occasional man, such as Turin, could match them. They were also, on average, the tallest race in Middle-earth, with both men and women usually being over 6 feet tall. It's said that the tallest person to ever live was King Thingol of Doriath. On a physical level, the Elves were hard to match individually. They were faster, more agile, and usually stronger than the other races. They were also innately ambidextrous, allowing them to easily wield weapons with either hand. They were also kind of capable of defying physics, such as like Legolas walking on top of the snow. Tolkien also proposed in his later writings that elves could move faster than what the human eyes were capable of tracking, and could effectively slow down time for themselves to react to things. Fortunately, the canonicity of this can be debated, as men and dwarves do beat elves in fights. Elves were also the most incorruptible of the races in Middle-earth. Although they were not above committing evil deeds, especially against each other, they never willingly served evil in the form of the Dark Lords. It's said that during the War of the Last Alliance, the Elves were the only major group that only fought against Sauron and not for him. This may have been partly due to the fact that Elves were generally more intelligent and wise than other races. This was inherent and was only reinforced by their long lifespans, allowing them to accrue a wealth of experience that other races could not. The Elves were also the best of the major races at Osanwe, which was basically telepathy. Even though magic is somewhat difficult to define in Middle-earth, the Elves were the most magical race. Many of their arts and crafts were inherently magical, everything from jewellery and weapons to ropes and food. Although the Dwarves were better craftsmen, perhaps with the exception of woodcraft, the Elves were seemingly better at creating magical artifacts, such as the Palantiri, the Feanorian lamps, and the Rings of Power. On top of that, Elves were the race that was most attuned to nature, especially when it came to forests and water. They often exerted their influence over the nature around them, beautifying it for themselves and making it terrible for their enemies. A couple of characteristics that all Elves shared was a love of learning and lore. Elves generally had the best lore masters and were the best at keeping history. They were the inventors of the two main writing systems used in Middle-earth, the Tengwar, invented by Feanor, and the Kerf, invented by Daeron. They were the best poets and the best singers, with renowned singers such as the aforementioned Daeron from the Sindar, and Maglor, who was from the Noldor. But when it comes to different groups of elves, there are stark differences. For example, the Noldor were not far off the dwarves when it came to metalwork and stonework, but other elven groups did not come close. The Teleri excelled beyond the other groups of elves when it came to shipbuilding and sailing, and it's possible they were the best in Middle-earth, although it's debatable whether the Numenorians surpassed them. Some groups of the Teleri, like the Sindar and the Sylvan Elves, were exceptional hunters and trackers. As for the Vanyar, they were the best at making good decisions and living really chill lives. Let's move on to the Dwarves. The most obvious thing the Dwarves excelled at was growing beards. No one else came close. But physically, they were also the best at other things. Dwarves are described as the toughest of the major races. They were better at living through pain, hunger, and injury better than anyone else. For example, when Thrain II was thrown into the dungeons of Dol Guldur and was forgotten, it took him 5 whole years to eventually die. They also seemingly had a resistance to fire that other races lacked, making them capable of withstanding dragons far better than anyone else. And like the elves, they were immune to sicknesses and diseases that affected men. But the actual most obvious thing that the dwarves excelled at was crafting. Even though elves such as the Noldor and men such as the Númenóreans were very capable themselves, the dwarves could not be matched when it came to crafting. They were the best at forging weapons and armor, and were often employed by men and elves to outfit them or build for them. They were the best at creating jewelry and using gems and other rare metals. They were naturally also the best at mining and building works of stone, both practical and of the beautiful kind. Interestingly, while decay is a theme in Middle-earth, the dwarves of the late Third Age were actually better at mining and building than they had ever been in the past. Dwarves were often considered the most warlike race. When enraged, they would stop at nothing to get revenge, even if their anger was unjustified. Combining that relentlessness with their expertly crafted weapons and armor, the dwarves were also often considered as the most formidable warriors in Middle-earth. Although individual elves and men could outclass them, as a fighting force, the dwarves were considered the best. A great example is at the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. When Maedhros' eastern host disintegrated, the dwarves of Belegost were the last force to hold their ground, and when they finally retreated from the battlefield after their lord, Azaghal, was killed, no one dared to disturb them. Dwarves were also the most mentally formidable race. Unlike elves, dwarves did sometimes serve evil, but only ever willingly, which is actually worse, but more cool at least. Dwarves were entirely resistant to mental domination and could not be broken by anyone. For example, unlike men, the dwarves did not become enslaved to the 7 rings that Sauron gave them, but it did inflame their greed, as dwarves were naturally the greediest of any race. Another example is at Isengard. When Saruman is attempting to use the power of his voice, Gimli completely ignores it and calls out Saruman for his deceit. Another interesting thing that the dwarves were probably the best at is language learning. Amongst themselves, the dwarves spoke their language of Khuzdul, but others found Khuzdul difficult to learn and found it harsh to their ears. As a result, dwarves pretty much always spoke the languages of their neighbours, whether it was Sindarin, Westron, or any of the various Northman languages. Even the vast majority of dwarven names that we know, from Durin to Gimli, were translations, likely of a Northman language. Let's move on to men. After everything I've just said about elves and dwarves, you might genuinely be wondering what men could possibly be best at, but don't worry, there are a few things. Like elves, it's also worth mentioning that different groups of men had vastly different capabilities. For example, the Druidine and the Númenóreans were so different from each other that they had almost nothing in common beyond both being men. Also, rather unfairly, most of the time I talk about men being good at something, it's usually because of the Númenóreans, who were really only one step removed from elves. So let's talk about what the Númenóreans were best at. They were certainly the best at empire building. While you can argue that elves and dwarves never had the same desire to do so, it doesn't change the fact that the Númenóreans built the greatest, most powerful empire that the world had ever seen. The Númenórean military was also basically unmatched and had a logistics network that allowed it to sail far and wide around Middle-earth. Speaking of sailing, it's arguable that the Númenóreans might have been the best at shipbuilding, and even if they lose out to the Teleri in that regard, at the very least, they were the best at building giant warships. The Númenóreans were very adept at many other things, fighting, law-keeping, building and crafting, but they weren't the best at all of these things. The dwarves and the elves, specifically the Noldor, were just a little bit better at most things. That being said, one could easily argue that the Númenóreans were the most well-rounded group, in the sense that they had many strengths and very few, if any, weaknesses. In the broad sense, maybe only the Noldor of the First Age could outclass them. Now, let's talk about men as a whole. The first thing men were best at, and this is a very common trope of fantasy and sci-fi settings, is adaptability. This is in regards to things like climate. Dwarves always lived in mountains, elves usually lived in nicer places, but men lived absolutely everywhere. Forests, mountains, hills, frozen lands, desert lands, barren lands, you name it. Men were also more adaptable when it came to circumstances. They could be brought to absolute ruin, reduced to remnants, but still find a way to survive and bounce back far better than elves or dwarves ever could. Men were also arguably the most valiant of the 3 main races. Men recognized that their lifespans were short and the vigor of their youth was fleeting, so they weren't afraid to give it everything they had. This is demonstrated routinely throughout the First Age. Some of the most daring deeds of the age were performed by men like Turin, Huron, Tuor, Barahir, and Baron, in battles throughout the First Age, men from all three houses regularly fought to the death. At the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, both the men of the House of Halef and the House of Hador were pretty much wiped out in two separate rearguard actions. Even men who served the enemy were often valiant. Throughout the War of the Ring, the Haradrim and the Easterlings regularly fight to the death. And despite all of their shortcomings, men could also be the most wholesome of the three main races. I'm speaking specifically of the hobbits, who are part of the race of men. Although there's a few rotten individuals, as a group, the hobbits lack ambition, and they are much more grounded in the simpler things in life. Whereas elves, dwarves, and other men are often about grand designs involving wealth, power, and war, hobbits are really just happy with food and gardening. It's why hobbits made for the perfect ring bearers. They were surprisingly tough and resilient, and so lacking in desire for greater things that the One Ring really struggled to get its hooks in. Unfortunately, because this isn't something to aim for, men could also be the cruelest of the three main races. Many groups of men had no problems with killing or enslaving each other. In some cases, men sunk to lows that would be completely unfathomable to elves and dwarves, such as practicing dark magic or even human sacrifice. We're even told that Sauron's most cruel servants were actually those men who were closest to him in service, not the orcs that made up his armies. Which says a lot, as orcs took pleasure in tormenting, torturing, and sometimes even eating their prisoners. Speaking of orcs, I'll perhaps end this video by talking about what they are best at. And honestly, it's kind of difficult to say. As I just said, men were capable of greater cruelty, but unlike men, orcs were pretty much only capable of cruelty. They were capable of creating devious, vicious weapons of war, but we can't say for sure that they were the best at it. We could also make the argument that orcs were best at surviving in certain conditions. After all, they lived in filth, and usually in the most inhospitable of places, such as frozen wastes, fiery hells, and unforgiving mountains. One thing I think orcs can claim is that they're the best foot soldiers. Sure, they're not the best warriors, the heroes mow them down by the dozen. Sure, they're not the bravest, they often flee when the tide turns against them, and sometimes even when they have the advantage. Sure, they're not the most disciplined, they will turn on each other at a moment's notice, and even on their superiors if they're not kept in line. But despite all of that, orcs do have a fantastic quality. They're meek. What this means is that if the whip against their back is deadly enough, orcs will fight in ways that men, elves, and dwarves do not. They will suicidally launch themselves at their enemies without a single thought of self-preservation. They will follow orders that are clearly just going to get them killed. If your course of action is to use human waves, you can't really do that with elves, men, or dwarves. They just won't do it. But orcs, well, they're perfect for that. So in summary, the elves are the most beautiful, the most physically capable, the most magical, the most incorruptible, and the most learned of the three races. The dwarves are the toughest, both mentally, physically. They're the best miners, crafters, and builders, and they're probably the best as a fighting force. Men are the most adaptable. They're the bravest, and the most ambitious, capable of the most virtue, but also the most evil. And finally, orcs are the best foot soldiers, simply because you can order them to their deaths like no one else. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I know this video was rather broad, so let me know if you want me to focus on something specific, such as why the dwarves might have been the best military force. Also, if you disagree with anything, please do state so in the comments, I'll only be slightly angry. Also, if you have any suggestions for other who was best at what videos, please let me know. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you're submissive, you actually have quite a bit in common with orcs.